"Mom, stop calling me. I have my own life." Those were the last words my son said before hanging up the phone. He thought he was ending a conversation. He had no idea he was starting something that would change both of our lives forever. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 72 years old, and until that afternoon in Franklin, Tennessee, I still believed that if I loved my son enough, if I stayed patient enough, if I kept reaching out, eventually things would go back to the way they used to be. Looking back now, I realize I had been holding on to a version of Ryan that no longer existed. The call happened on a Thursday afternoon in early October. The sunlight streamed through my kitchen window, casting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. A pot of vegetable soup simmered quietly on the stove. The smell reminded me of the years when Ryan would burst through the front door after school, hungry enough to eat 2 bowls before dinner. I remember standing by the counter with my phone in my hand, debating whether I should call him. It had been nearly 3 weeks since we'd spoken. 3 weeks since he had ignored my last voicemail. 2 weeks since he had left my text message unread. 1 week since I mailed a birthday card to my grandson and never received a thank you. I told myself he was busy. That was always the excuse. Ryan was busy. Ryan had meetings. Ryan had deadlines. Ryan had family obligations. Yet somehow there was always enough time for everyone except his mother. I stared at his name on my screen for nearly a minute before pressing call. The phone rang 3 times. Then he answered. For a brief moment my heart lifted. Hearing your child's voice never stops meaning something, no matter how old they become. "Hey Mom," he said. His tone was flat, distracted, like someone answering a customer service call. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "I was just checking in. I wanted to see how you and the kids were doing." There was silence. Not the comfortable silence families share. The kind that feels warm. This silence felt cold. Heavy. Then I heard him sigh. "Mom, I'm really busy right now." "I understand," I said quickly. "I just haven't heard from you in a while." Another sigh. Longer this time. "Mom, you can't keep doing this." My stomach tightened. Doing what? Calling all the time. I looked at the calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. The last call I had made was almost 3 weeks earlier. "Ryan, I don't call all the time. It feels like all the time." His voice sharpened. "Every time my phone rings, it's another check-in. Another question. Another voicemail." I gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm your mother. And I'm 44 years old." The words landed harder than he probably intended. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then came the sentence I still remember word for word. "Mom, stop calling me." Just like that. No anger. No shouting. Somehow that made it worse. It was calm. Casual. As if he were asking someone to stop sending advertisements. "Stop calling me. I'll reach out if I need something." Before I could answer, the line went dead. I stood there staring at my phone. The kitchen suddenly felt larger than it had a few minutes earlier. The ticking clock above the pantry sounded louder. The soup continued bubbling on the stove as if nothing had happened. I lowered myself into a chair and sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. The tears never came. Instead, I felt something else. Something colder. Something clearer. For years I had been chasing after a relationship that only existed in my memories. For years I had excused behavior that would have broken my late husband's heart. George used to tell me, "One day you'll have to stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices." Back then I thought he was being too harsh. That afternoon I finally understood what he meant. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I made coffee, watched the Tennessee sky slowly turn pink beyond my front porch. Then I picked up my phone again. But this time I didn't call Ryan. I searched for a different number. One I hadn't used in nearly 5 years. When Benjamin Hayes answered, he sounded surprised to hear my voice. "Evelyn," he said, "what can I do for you?" I looked out across the property George and I had built together over 4 decades. Then I gave him an answer that surprised even me. "Benjamin," I said quietly, "I think it's finally time for us to review my estate plan." What he told me during that meeting 3 days later would reveal a truth I never saw coming. Early the next morning, I drove into town for my appointment with Benjamin Hayes. The courthouse square looked exactly as it had for decades. The same brick storefronts. The same church steeple rising above the trees. The same coffee shop where George, And I used to stop on Saturday mornings after running errands. Some places seem untouched by time. People are different. People change quietly while you are busy believing they never will. Benjamin's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building overlooking Main Street. When I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me by name. That surprised me. Then I remembered how many years George and I had worked with Benjamin. Estate planning, property records, tax documents, things that seem boring when life was normal, things that suddenly become very important when it is not. Benjamin emerged from his office carrying a leather folder. His gray hair was thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Evelyn," he said warmly. "It has been too long." I smiled politely and followed him into his office. Framed photographs covered the walls. Law degrees, family pictures, community awards. Familiar signs of a man who had spent his life helping local families navigate difficult decisions. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things, the weather, the town, mutual friends. Then his expression grew serious. He opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. "Tell me why you wanted to review everything now." I looked down at my hands. The skin seemed thinner than it once had. Older, more fragile, yet somehow stronger. "Because I finally realized something," I said. "I have been planning my future based on people who may not actually be part of it." Benjamin studied me carefully. He did not rush to fill the silence. Good attorneys understand the value of silence. Eventually he nodded. "Then we should take a fresh look at everything." For nearly 2 hours we reviewed documents I had not seen in years. Property deeds, trust, agreements, beneficiary designations. Some papers carried George's signature. Seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing a familiar voice from another room. It hurt, but it also brought comfort. Then Benjamin reached the final section of the file. His fingers paused on a document near the bottom. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "What is it?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "There is something your husband instructed me to keep on file." I frowned. "Something I do not know about?" "Something he hoped would never become necessary." The room seemed unusually quiet. Even the ticking wall clock sounded distant. Benjamin removed a sealed envelope from the folder. My name was written across the front in George's unmistakable handwriting. For several seconds I simply stared at it. I had never seen this envelope before. Never heard it mentioned. My pulse quickened. "When did he leave this?" I asked softly. Benjamin folded his hands. 3 months before he passed away. I swallowed hard. "And what is inside?" Benjamin looked directly at me. His final instructions regarding the family property and the conditions attached to its inheritance. My heart skipped. George had always been thoughtful, careful, protective. But suddenly I realized he may have seen something years ago that I had refused to see. As I slowly reached for the envelope, Benjamin said one sentence that made my stomach tighten. "Evelyn, after you read this, you may understand your son's situation very differently than you do today." I carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age, but George's handwriting remained steady and familiar. For a moment, I forgot I was sitting in a lawyer's office. It felt as though he were sitting across from me again at our kitchen table. The first line alone made my eyes sting. "If you are reading this, Evelyn, it means something has changed in our family, and I am sorry I am not there to help you through it." I took a slow breath and continued reading. George wrote about the property we had spent 42 years building together. The house, the land, the savings, the investments. Things that looked like numbers on paper but represented an entire lifetime of work. Then I reached the section that made me stop. George explained that several years before his death, he had quietly amended portions of our estate plan. Not because he distrusted Ryan, but because he understood something about human nature. People often revealed their true priorities when they believed an inheritance was guaranteed. My hands trembled slightly as I continued. George wrote that any future inheritance connected to the family property would depend upon maintaining a meaningful relationship with the surviving spouse. He described it as a family responsibility rather than a legal obligation. If that relationship was deliberately abandoned, Significant portions of the inheritance could be redirected elsewhere according to specific instructions already filed with Benjamin. I looked up from the letter. Benjamin remained silent. He had clearly seen this reaction before. George created this years ago? I asked quietly. Benjamin nodded. After several conversations we had regarding long-term family planning, I lowered my eyes back to the page. Suddenly memories began fitting together in ways they never had before. George had noticed things. Small things. Ryan canceling visits at the last minute. Melissa discouraging family gatherings. The increasing distance that I had always dismissed as normal adulthood. George had not ignored those signs. He simply never wanted to hurt me by discussing them. Near the end of the letter, another paragraph caught my attention. Evelyn, if Ryan remains the man we raised, none of this will ever matter. If he forgets what family means, I want you protected. Do not sacrifice your dignity to keep people close. The people who truly love you will never require that sacrifice. I stared at those words for a long time. The room felt unusually still. I could almost hear George's voice saying them. For years I had done exactly what he warned against. I had accepted disappointment, excused neglect, lowered expectations, each time believing patience would eventually repair the relationship. Yet nothing improved. The distance only grew larger. Benjamin finally spoke. There is more. He opened another folder and slid several documents across the desk. Property records, trust provisions, beneficiary schedules. Legal language covered every page. Most of it was complicated. One detail was not. Under the current structure, I maintained complete authority over every major decision regarding the estate. Nothing automatically transferred to Ryan. Nothing became available simply because he expected it to. I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. It was not anger. It was not revenge. It was clarity. For the first time since George died, I stopped seeing myself as a lonely widow waiting for family to remember her. I saw myself as the steward of everything we had built together. When the meeting finally ended, Benjamin walked me to the door. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me all the way home. Evelyn, many people wait until a crisis forces them to act. You still have choices. As I drove back toward the property, the autumn sunlight stretched across the fields. For years I had focused on what Ryan was no longer giving me. That afternoon, I began wondering something entirely different. What if the future of this family no longer depended on Ryan at all? The days that followed felt different. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything seemed clearer. The house was the same. The fields beyond my porch were the same. The old oak tree George planted 30 years ago still stood near the fence line. But I was no longer looking at my life through the lens of waiting. For years I had spent my energy waiting for Ryan to call, waiting for invitations, waiting for signs that I still mattered. Now I found myself paying attention to other things. One Friday afternoon, Linda stopped by again. We sat on the porch drinking sweet tea while the autumn wind carried leaves across the yard. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Then she hesitated. I recognized that look immediately. It was the look people get when they are deciding whether they should tell you something unpleasant. What is it? I asked. Linda looked down at her glass. I ran into Melissa last week. I said nothing. She was having lunch with a few women from church. Another pause followed. Evelyn, I do not know if I should tell you this. I felt my stomach tighten. Tell me anyway. Linda sighed. They were talking about downsizing and retirement communities. Melissa mentioned that it would probably be easier once you moved somewhere smaller. For a moment I simply stared at the trees. Moved? I asked quietly. Linda nodded. She spoke as though it was already decided. A strange calm settled over me. A month earlier those words would have devastated me. Now they simply confirmed something I was beginning to understand. Other people had been making plans for my future without ever asking what I wanted. Linda continued carefully. She also mentioned the property. My eyes shifted toward her. What about it? She said maintaining land like this is expensive, and that younger families can make better use of it. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it sounded familiar. The language was nearly identical to conversations George had quietly worried about years ago. Practical. Reasonable. Polite. Yet somehow every version of the plan seemed to end with me giving something up. After Linda left, I spent the rest of the evening walking across the property. The pasture stretched nearly 6 acres behind the house. Every fence post carried memories. Every corner held pieces of our family history. Ryan learned to ride a bicycle on that gravel driveway. He caught his first fish in the pond near the western boundary. George taught him how to repair a tractor in the equipment shed. We built a life here. Not a collection of assets. A life. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something else. Ryan had not visited the property alone in nearly 4 years. Every visit had been brief. Every conversation rushed. He rarely asked about the house anymore. He rarely asked about me. Yet according to Linda, discussions about the property's future were happening regularly. That thought stayed with me all weekend. On Monday morning I called Benjamin again. We scheduled another meeting. This time I arrived with a notebook full of questions. Questions I should have asked long ago. As Benjamin reviewed additional documents, one particular record caught my attention. It showed several inquiries regarding property valuations made within the past 18 months. My pulse quickened. Who requested these? I asked. Benjamin adjusted his glasses and studied the paperwork. Then his expression changed. Slowly he looked up at me. Evelyn, he said carefully, I think there is something else you need to know about Ryan and Melissa's recent plans. Benjamin slid the document across the desk and allowed me a moment to read it myself. The paperwork was straightforward. Over the past 18 months, multiple inquiries had been made regarding estimated market values, development potential, and future resale projections connected to the property. None of those actions transferred ownership. None violated any laws. Yet the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had spent a great deal of time studying what the property might be worth in the future. I looked up slowly. Did Ryan request these? I asked. Benjamin chose his words carefully. The requests came through third parties connected to financial planning discussions. I cannot speak to every conversation involved, but the records suggest ongoing interest. I sat back in my chair. The office suddenly felt smaller. For years I had worried about losing my relationship with my son. Now I found myself wondering whether someone had already been planning a future that depended on assets rather than relationships. Benjamin remained calm. Evelyn, I want to be clear. Interest in property is not unusual. Families discuss these things all the time. What matters is how those discussions are handled. I nodded. He was right. The documents alone proved nothing. Yet when combined with everything else, the picture became harder to dismiss. The reduced visits. The unanswered calls. The conversations about downsizing. The assumptions about where I might live someday. Each piece by itself looked harmless. Together they told a different story. On the drive home, I took the long route through the countryside. Rolling hills stretched across the Tennessee landscape beneath a bright autumn sky. George always preferred this road. He said it gave him time to think. By the time I reached the property, I understood something important. I no longer needed to guess what Ryan felt. His actions had already answered that question. The following week passed quietly. I focused on things I had neglected for years. I met friends for lunch. I attended a community fundraiser. I spent an afternoon organizing old photographs. In one picture, Ryan could not have been more than 8 years old. He stood beside George holding a fishing rod almost as tall as he was. Both of them were smiling. I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger. I still loved that little boy. Nothing would ever change that. But love and trust were not always the same thing. Late Thursday afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. For a moment I simply stared at it. 3 weeks earlier I would have answered before the first ring finished. This time I waited. Eventually I picked up. Hello, Ryan. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hey, Mom. Just checking in. The words almost made me laugh. Not because they were funny, because they were familiar. They sounded like the kind of call people make when they suddenly remember something important. We spoke for several minutes. He asked about my health, the weather, the property, especially the property. Nothing directly. Just casual questions woven into ordinary conversation. Had I made any repairs lately? Was I still maintaining the back acreage? Had I considered hiring someone to help with upkeep? I answered politely, carefully. By the end of the call, I felt more certain than ever that something had changed on his side of the equation. After we hung up, I sat quietly on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Then my phone vibrated again. This time it was a text message from Linda. Only one sentence. You might want to know that Melissa was asking around town about estate attorneys today. I stared at the screen. The evening air suddenly felt colder. Because for the first time, it seemed possible that Ryan and Melissa were beginning to realize their assumptions about the future might not be as secure as they once believed. Over the next several weeks, I said very little and observed a great deal. That was something George had always been good at. He used to say that people revealed themselves when they believed nobody was paying attention. The more I thought about those words, the more accurate they seemed. Ryan began calling more often. Not constantly, but enough for me to notice the difference. Every few days my phone would ring. He would ask how I was feeling. He would ask whether I needed help around the property. He would ask whether I had considered making any major changes to the house. The conversation sounded caring on the surface. Yet beneath each question I sensed something else. A kind of cautious curiosity. As though he were trying to gather information without appearing to do so. I remained polite. Friendly. Calm. I answered only what needed answering. Meanwhile, my meetings with Benjamin continued. We reviewed every document connected to the estate. Every trust provision. Every beneficiary designation. Every contingency George had carefully established years earlier. The process took time, but for the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my own future. One afternoon, Benjamin looked across his desk and said something that stayed with me. Evelyn, clarity is a gift. Most people spend years avoiding it. He was right. For too long I had confused hope with reality. Hope had convinced me that silence meant temporary distance. Reality showed me something different. Reality showed me patterns, actions, choices. On a cool November morning, Ryan called again. This time he sounded unusually enthusiastic. He mentioned that he and Melissa were thinking about bringing the children out to visit the property during the holidays. The suggestion caught me off guard. The grandchildren had not spent a full day there in nearly 3 years. That sounds nice, I said carefully. We should do that, he replied quickly. The kids need to stay connected to family traditions. Family traditions. The phrase echoed in my mind long after the call ended. It was interesting how traditions suddenly became important after years of neglect. A few days later, Linda stopped by with a casserole and more local news. Small towns have a way of circulating information without anyone trying. She sat at my kitchen table and stirred sugar into her coffee. I heard something interesting yesterday, she said. I waited. Melissa has been telling people how excited the family is about preserving the property for future generations. I almost smiled. Not because the statement was offensive, because it sounded remarkably different from earlier conversations about downsizing, development opportunities, and practical alternatives. The narrative seemed to be changing. That evening, I walked through the house carrying an old photo album. Room by room, memory after memory unfolded before me. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, decades of life preserved inside fading photographs. I paused on a picture of Ryan standing beside George during the construction of the barn. They were both covered in dust and smiling proudly at the camera. Looking at that image, I felt sadness. Not anger. Not bitterness. Sadness for the relationship we had lost somewhere along the way. Yet another feeling was growing beside it. Acceptance. I could not control Ryan's choices. I could only control my own. As Thanksgiving approached, an unexpected invitation arrived. Ryan wanted the entire family to gather at my house. He said it had been too long. He said everyone missed spending time together. The request sounded innocent enough. But when I mentioned it during my next meeting with Benjamin, he became very quiet. Then he opened a folder I had never seen before and placed a single document on the desk. Before that gathering happens, he said carefully, there is one more piece of information you need to understand about the estate. Benjamin pushed the document toward me and folded his hands. The paper looked ordinary at first glance. A few pages. Legal language. Signatures. Dates. Yet I had learned enough by then to know that life-changing information often arrived in very plain packaging. What am I looking at? I asked. Benjamin adjusted his glasses. This is the final amendment George filed 6 months before his death. I began reading slowly. The language was formal, but the meaning became clear. George had established a review process tied to the family trust. Any future inheritance connected to the property would not simply pass from one generation to the next automatically. Instead, beneficiaries would be evaluated according to specific conditions regarding family involvement, good faith relationships, and ongoing participation in family responsibilities. I looked up. George really thought all of this through. Benjamin nodded. He wanted the property to remain connected to the values that built it. I lowered my eyes to the page again. Then I noticed something else. A clause that had never mattered before. A clause that suddenly mattered very much. If a beneficiary demonstrated a prolonged pattern of voluntary estrangement from the surviving spouse, discretionary authority shifted entirely to the surviving spouse. In simple terms, the future of the estate depended on me. Not on assumptions. Not on expectations. Me. I sat quietly for several seconds. The realization felt heavy. Not because it gave me power. Because it gave me responsibility. George had trusted me to protect what we built. Benjamin watched my expression carefully. You understand what this means? He asked. I think so. It means nobody is entitled to anything simply because they expect it. As Thanksgiving approached, preparations for the family gathering moved forward. Ryan called several times to discuss details. Melissa sent messages offering to bring side dishes and desserts. The grandchildren seemed excited. On the surface, everything looked normal, almost ideal. Yet beneath the pleasant conversations, I sensed an urgency that had not existed before. One evening, Ryan asked whether Benjamin was still handling family legal matters. The question arrived casually. Too casually. Sometimes, I replied. Why do you ask? There was a brief pause. No reason. Just curious. Curious. That word lingered in my thoughts long after the call ended. A few days later, Linda shared another piece of information. Apparently Melissa had been asking questions around town again. Questions about trusts. Questions about inheritance timelines. Questions about property ownership structures. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing alarming by itself. Yet the timing felt impossible to ignore. Thanksgiving morning arrived bright and cool. Cars began pulling into the driveway shortly before noon. For the first time in years, the house felt full again. Children's laughter echoed through the rooms. The smell of turkey and baked rolls filled the kitchen. Family photographs seemed to come alive around us. Ryan hugged me when he arrived. Melissa smiled warmly. Everything looked exactly the way I had wished it would look for years. That was what made the experience so complicated. Part of me enjoyed every moment. Another part could not forget how quickly affection had reappeared once uncertainty entered the picture. During dinner, I watched everyone carefully. The conversations, the glances, the subtle questions about future plans. Then, halfway through dessert, Ryan set down his coffee cup and cleared his throat. The room remained cheerful, relaxed, ordinary, but something in his expression changed. He looked at me and smiled. Mom, he said, there is actually something Melissa and I wanted to talk with you about regarding the future of the property. Around the table, several conversations quietly faded away. And in that moment, I realized the discussion I had been expecting for weeks was finally about to begin. The room grew quiet after Ryan spoke. Not completely silent. Just quiet enough that everyone understood the conversation had shifted. The grandchildren continued eating pie, unaware of the tension settling around the table. Melissa smiled politely and folded her hands. Ryan leaned forward slightly. We have been thinking a lot about the future, he said. This property means so much to the family. I nodded. It does. He seemed encouraged. We just want to make sure everything stays protected for future generations. Future generations. The phrase sounded familiar. I had heard it several times over the previous few weeks. That is important, I replied. Ryan glanced briefly at Melissa before continuing. We were wondering if you had thought about any long-term plans. There it was. The question beneath all the other questions. The one that had been approaching for months, maybe years. I set down my coffee cup and looked around the table. Family photographs lined the walls. Holiday decorations filled the corners of the room. For a moment, I felt the weight of every Thanksgiving George and I had hosted together. Then I smiled. Actually, I have. Ryan's expression brightened. Melissa sat a little straighter. You have? He asked. Yes. I paused. I have spent the last several months reviewing everything carefully. Neither of them spoke. George left very clear instructions, I continued, and I finally realized it was my responsibility to honor them. The room remained still. I was not angry. I was not accusing anyone of anything. I was simply telling the truth. A few weeks ago, I updated my estate plan. Ryan blinked. Melissa's smile faded slightly. Updated it? She asked. Yes. I folded my hands. After a great deal of thought. Nobody interrupted. For years, I worried about who would eventually receive this property. Then I realized I had been asking the wrong question. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? I looked directly at him. The real question is who values family when there is nothing to gain. The words hung gently in the air. Not harsh. Not dramatic. Just honest. I saw confusion in his eyes. Then concern. Then understanding. Slow understanding. The kind that arrives when someone finally sees consequences standing in front of them. Mom. He began. I raised a hand softly. Ryan, I love you. I always will. My voice remained calm. But love does not mean ignoring reality. Nobody moved. When your father died, I spent years waiting for a phone call. Waiting for visits. Waiting for signs that I still mattered. Melissa looked down at the table. I made excuses for things that should never have required excuses. Ryan opened his mouth again, then closed it. For the first time in years, he seemed unable to find the right words. The future of this property is secure, I said. But more importantly, so am I. A long silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. The tension left me completely. Not because I had won anything. Because I finally stopped. Carrying a burden that was never mine to carry. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the front porch. The November air was cool. The field stretched quietly beneath the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell echoed across the countryside. I thought about the phone call that had started everything. The call that once felt like rejection. Looking back, I understood it differently. That moment had forced me to stop chasing a place in someone else's priorities and start protecting my own peace. George had been right all along. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you choose to keep. As I watched the lights disappear along the distant road, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not victory. Not revenge. Peace. And for the first time since George passed away, peace was enough.